Ananya Rajan, and I am the director of the Crotona School, and my colleagues and I here at the Crotona School welcome you to this program. For those of you who have not attended a Crotona program, just to give you a little background, Crotona is a nonprofit organization. We're an international community that is set in the beautiful valley of Ojai in California. Our focus is our community is dedicated to the deeper understanding and self-realization of the ageless wisdom, spiritual self-transformation, and the unity of all life. Those are the things that we focus on here. We do offer personal retreats and accommodation for programs that we have in person. Today, we have Dr. Ravi Ravindra, who is known as Ravi Ji to me, which is a very normal thing that many of us say when we're giving respect to someone who is, well, sometimes when they're older than we are, but also someone who has a background that is one that we respect highly. And as all of you know, Ravi Ji has quite a profound background in philosophy and religion and comparative religion. And he's just a walking encyclopedia of information with regard to different paths and the sages who are out there. Sitting with him and just having, which we will be doing afterwards, we're going to have an exchange after the first hour. It is always, one walks away with many, many notes and lots to think about. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else that I need to cover. Many of you know he is Professor Emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. And he has taught in the different departments of physics and comparative religion and philosophy, which is a lovely combination because we all know how well those all go together. So I'm not going to keep on talking. I'm going to hand it over to him.
Okay. Just to give a general schedule for our gathering, we'll begin just for a few minutes of quieting the mind. Because just to remind you a remark of Madame Blavatsky, the mind is the slayer of the truth. This is not my remark, this is Madame Blavatsky's remark. And there are many, many suggestions by all the spiritual teachers that there are many levels of reality subtler than the mind, and that the mind cannot grasp it. So we'll take a few moments for that. And then I will actually use some slides, partly because often people keep asking me for a precise reference, etc., and it allows us to focus on something. And then that will probably finish within about an hour, what I have just said. And then we'll take a few minutes break. At least in Ojai at Crotona, my impression is that many people came to these webinars really for the sake of that break, because during that break there was always lovely food given by people who brought them from somewhere or the other. And now I may be wrong about it, but at least I enjoyed the break myself and everybody else did. So, but here now you'll just have to have your own break at your own place for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes. And then we'll come back, and please bring your questions or your own insight. It doesn't have to be a question that you have questions and I have answers. No, any serious question cannot be answered by anybody else. That has to become your own quest. Informational questions are easy to answer. That's a different kind of question. But to hear your own quest will be very helpful. Other people can participate in it. So let me first of all remind all of us that you or I, we did not create ourselves. Who could disagree with this? And what is keeping me alive and keeping you alive is this remarkable spirit called breath in us. And we have a tendency to say, I am breathing, as if I decided to start breathing, or I decided to create this breathing operation, or the breath that I need to breathe. None of this has come from me in my case. All this is divine energy as has expressed by scriptures. For example, I invite you, if most of you are probably from Judeo-Christian background, the book of Genesis, 2nd chapter, 7th verse. This is what it says. God created human beings from the earth, then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. As long as I am alive, or you are alive, it's the breath of God that is keeping us alive, not my breath. I would have no idea how to create this breathing apparatus. So one needs to actually realize that our very existence is a divine blessing. And then very strong suggestion in all spiritual teachings that this spiritual energy is eager to connect with whatever I call me. In my case, my body, my mind. That is what gets called Ravi. Because this spiritual energy has taken on this body mind in order to evolve at whatever level it now is in me, it wishes to evolve back to the source, to come back to God. This is the main reason why I often try to clarify something that has become very confused, mostly in my Christian friends, that the word spirit and soul refer to two completely different entities. Every book in the New Testament was initially written in Greek. The word for spirit is pneuma, and the word for soul is psyche. In English, we will say psyche, but in ancient Greek, it is psyche. Doesn't matter how it is pronounced, but it is written as psyche. Psyche is personal, or soul, if you like, is personal. Your soul is different from my soul. But spirit is transpersonal. And the call of the soul to take on my body is so that my body and mind can undertake the appropriate action to assist the evolution of my soul, or I should say soul in me rather than my soul. I didn't make it. So it can assist the evolution of this soul to return back to the quality of the spirit, and that is basically the same as the quality of God. That's the call. Great Saint Augustine, nearly 1900 years ago, said, God became man so that the man may become God. That is the call. So, therefore, it's a good idea to pay attention to your breath. I say your breath because that's the usual language. It's really the divine breath in you, or the divine breath in me. It's not my breath. And in all ancient languages, certainly in Hebrew, Chinese, Sanskrit, the word for breath and for spirit is either exactly the same or very close to each other. For example, the word pneuma also means breath, it also means spirit. Similarly, the word prana in Sanskrit means both of these things. Just I'm reminding you that again and again to pay a little attention to your breath is trying to connect with this divine energy. Of course, we always have rather limited time online here, so we can't stay with that. But even during our exchange or during our gathering for nearly 2 hours, whenever you become aware of your breath, it's a good idea to take a moment just to pay attention to it. As I said, we keep saying your breath, really it's the divine breath in you. Language is needed, but it also interferes with the truth. So what I'm now going to do is to actually use some slides, partly because occasionally people ask me for specific references, etc. But also you can then focus on it. And then I'm imagining that afterwards, each one of you would receive a recording of this whole talk. Then you can actually again look at those slides carefully. So please, Ananya, allow me to share the slides.
You should.
Now, my intention is that during our gathering, as you know, we'll be meeting 11 times. Each time I will choose a remark of one of the great sages and then spend our time reflecting on it, exploring it, and to see how we can understand this. Here is a remark of Rumi, a great Sufi sage. Everything in the universe is within you. Ask all from yourself. Even in the modern scientific terminology, the whole external cosmos is actually mirrored inside us. Each one of us is, strictly speaking, a hologram of the whole universe. And therefore, as you know, in the scientific realm, the strong tendency is to look outside. In the spiritual realm, the tendency or the call is to look inside. You can read any of the scriptural texts. They're always inviting us to look within, to connect with that level of reality that belongs to the divine energy. And so let me first of all begin from the oldest text in any Indo-European language, the Rig Veda. I know not whether I am the same as this cosmos, a mystery am I. Yet, burdened by my mind, I wonder. What am I or who am I is the fundamental spiritual inquiry. Associated with this is, why am I here? Unless we imagine that God or Krishna or this divine energy is just stupid, there must be some reason for this energy to create me. Unless they're just wasting their energy. But then, how do I correspond to that call? That requires a constant reminder, even starting from the oldest texts and in the modern sages, repeatedly saying to look to find out who are you. Here is, again, I quote from another great text in India, a Maha-Upanishad. Who am I? Whence is this widespread cosmic flux? These the wise should inquire into diligently, soon, nay, now. This is the call. That this is, who am I? I personally prefer the expression, what am I? But it doesn't matter, whatever expression speaks to you. Associated with this, why am I here? Now, you see, one of the Psalms, again, is concerned about similar question. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? These days, scientists are telling us we have more than 2 trillion galaxies. Even one galaxy will do. The writer of this psalm is not necessarily concerned about many galaxies, but just looking at the moon and the stars. Then one wonders, in this large universe, Now we can say it's an extremely large universe. Why have I been created? What is man that thou art mindful of him? Here is a remark of a well-known scientist, Pascal. As you know, we measure pressure in terms of how many pascals. When I consider the short duration of my life, now he was writing nearly 400 years ago. At that time, we were not aware of other galaxies. We were not thinking of the universe being that old. But even then, he realizes that his life is very short in the context of the planet. When I consider the short duration of my life swallowed up in the eternity before and after, the little space which I fill and even can see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened. And I am astonished at being here rather than there. For there is no reason why here rather than there. Why not now? Sorry, why now rather than then? Who has put me here? By whose order and direction have this place and time been allotted to me? This is Pascal. He then actually gave up doing science and became a monk in a monastery, again returned to do science. So one doesn't need to be against the business of doing science, but the kind of question that he's raising are not the questions that get raised in the science. So let me remind you again, nowadays we say 2 trillion galaxies. And according to all the spiritual teachings, that the whole universe is pervaded by cosmic intelligence. Another very simple way of saying is that God is omnipresent. But just think about this for a moment. If you really believe this, God is right in front of you, behind you, inside you. You can't get away from this tyrannical God or compassionate God, whatever you imagine him to be. But it is pervading the whole universe. And then very strong suggestion that there are obviously many levels of consciousness, from the rocks to the absolute. Absolute is another way of referring to God. There are many different ways: God, Allah, Brahma, absolute, or simply that, or the unknown, or the mysterious. There are varieties of ways referring to this. But in the spiritual realm, what is important is that the manifested universe is by involution, starting from the highest level, which is God, downwards. And then the suggestion is that each level is wishing to evolve to return to the source. Whatever you people think, whenever you say, I have a spiritual urge, what is that urge? Why does one undertake any spiritual teaching? Essentially, of course, one can express this in varieties of ways, but essentially, in order to evolve one's level of awareness, consciousness, that one can actually become aware of the divine energies inside me, around me, everywhere. So, but as you see, this is completely contrary to the modern scientific attitude, which started in the 16th century, where everything begins from matter without any consciousness. If you have taken even the smallest or the earliest course in physics, we say MLT, mass, length, and time. That's what you have to define. Later on in the 19th century, charge was added to that. In the 20th century, spin was added because of quantum mechanics. But in general, the underlying whole idea is that everything begins from dead matter without any consciousness, which is completely contrary to the whole spiritual notion that everything begins from the highest level of consciousness. So it's useful to be a little clear about what the. Now, there is no need to argue about any of this, at least not in our webinars here. But just to remind you that even in the scientific realm, this is now being questioned. Some of you are probably aware of a new organization started about 4 or 5 years ago called the Galileo Commission, which is actually started mostly by scientists, including myself, who are saying that consciousness is primary, that matter is secondary, and that whole scientific world needs to reassert itself in a different manner. This is not going to be easily done, partly because science has got so much entangled with technology and therefore power. And just to remind you, more than 90% people who do physics degrees work either for the military or for the industry. So power is attached with it, energy is attached with it. So obviously, not anybody is going to leave it easily. But more and more suggestion that consciousness is primary. According to traditional scientific attitude, consciousness cannot exist without matter. But more and more data is now gathered, especially in so-called near-death experiences, that if a person dies, sometimes some of them come back alive again after maybe a few hours or a few minutes. And during that time when they were officially dead, not breathing, heart is not beating, but they still seem to have some consciousness. They can say what the doctor was saying to another doctor or to the nurse. So consciousness can exist without connection with matter is really becoming more and more obvious in these. Lots of data has been gathered about this. But it is good, on the other hand, to be clear why so-called science and religion arguments continue, because the whole basic idea is different, whether the universe starts from the lowest level of consciousness or from the highest level of consciousness. So basically, these are the two great mysteries that every spiritual teacher or person is really interested in. I have given their Sanskrit expressions also because some of you may have Indian background. Aham and idam. I and idam literally means this, meaning conscious, referring to the cosmos. Why have these intelligent and conscious energies taken the trouble to create me? What am I, or why am I here? This expression, koham, always translated who am I, is regarded in the Indian tradition as the fundamental question, koham. Again and again gets repeated. Here is a remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. An eternal portion of myself becomes the living creature, jiva in Sanskrit, in the world of jivas, and works upon the five senses as well as the sixth one, the manas, which are in Prakriti. The reason I'm mentioning here is just to point out that according to Krishna's remark in the Bhagavad Gita, myself being alive or you being alive, it's actually an eternal portion of Krishna who has taken on this body temporarily. But also another thing I wanted to point out here, he includes the ordinary mind, which in Sanskrit is manas, among the senses, because the ordinary mind just basically acts as a prostitute. Whatever the body wants or desires or fears, it justifies. Which is the reason why the call is to connect with a subtler level of the mind, or as Krishnamurti repeatedly kept saying, intelligence beyond thought. That subtler level of the mind in the Bhagavad Gita is called buddhi. In the Greek language, where also now it has got distorted, but earlier there were two words for the mind. Nous, N-O-U-S, if you like, for the higher mind or intelligence beyond thought, and dianoia for the usual mind. So manas is the usual analytical mind, which, as Krishna says here, is just like the senses. It just justifies whatever the fear and desire is obtained by the senses. Here is this quotation that I had earlier mentioned in passing, Genesis. The Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So the suggestion from the spiritual side is that your existence or my existence is being initiated by a spiritual energy that takes on a body for its purpose. So another way of saying, it's not that the body has the soul, it's the soul that has the body. One needs to be clear about it. Soul has taken on this body for its own purpose. And if the body, I use the word body, but including the mind, at least the lower mind, manas. Unless the body mind is willing to submit to this call from the spiritual energy, as far as the spiritual people are concerned, the birth is just wasted. Therefore, a very strong emphasis again and again on self-inquiry. Many other words get used: self-knowledge, self-observation, self-study, self-inquiry. So don't worry about this. Any word will do. But this is a remark of Krishnamurti here. Excuse me for a minute, I'll just stop this phone. Oh, it automatically stopped. Self-knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. And without that self-knowledge, you cannot go far. And to seek the absolute God, truth, or whatever you will, is merely the search after a self-projected gratification. Therefore, you must begin near and search every word that you speak. Search every gesture, the way you talk, the way you act, the way you eat. Be aware of everything without condemnation. Then, in that awareness, you will know what actually is and the transformation of what is. What is the beginning of liberation? Just to continue another remark of his, if I do not understand myself, my cravings, my motives, my contradictions, how can I comprehend truth? If I am not aware of my contradictory states, if I am passionate, ignorant, greedy, envious, meditation only strengthens the self-enclosing process. Without self-knowledge, there is no foundation for right thinking. Without right thinking, thought, feeling cannot transcend itself. So I mention some of these things just to emphasize again and again the whole strong emphasis on impartial self-knowledge. Sadly, you can look at the concordance of the whole Bible, you would not find a single entry under for self-knowledge. But in the Yoga Sutras, some of you are familiar with this. Here there are two different shlokas, which Swadhyay literally means self-study. There is no complexity about that. Anybody who has even the basic knowledge of Sanskrit, Swa plus Adhyay, meaning self and study. But tragically, as happens probably in every culture, how some degeneration takes place. If you look at contemporary Sanskrit English dictionaries, the first translation of Swadhyay, they say, is reading sacred books. only fourth or fifth translation is self-study. I think some of you probably heard me say that I had once mentioned this to Krishnamurti, and I have never heard him use that expression. He says, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of studying sacred books if you don't read the book of yourself?" That is really the call from all serious teachers, reading the book of yourself. Serious, impartial self-study. Here, the emphasis on, I just quoted to you from the Yoga Sutras, twice emphasis on swadhyaya, self-study. Here is a remark from Bhagavad Gita. There are some who practice yajna. By the way, the word yajna usually gets translated as sacrifice, which is, just to remind you, the word sacrifice comes from saker fakir, to make sacred. In order to relate with anything sacred, naturally I need to be a little free of what I am now attached to. So it requires a certain kind of sacrifice. But basically, this expression has now come to mean, particularly in the Indian context, any spiritual practice, not only sacrifice, but that's the usual translation of that in English. There are some who practice yajna by offering their material goods, others who undertake austere efforts and practice of yoga as yajna, and for still others, with serious vows, yajna consists of self-inquiry. That is the real spiritual practice according to Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and sacred knowledge. Just as I just finished saying, yajna is close to the original meaning of the word sacrifice, which comes from two Latin words, sacer and facer, to make sacred. Nothing can be sacred unless it relates us to a level higher than our usual level. Every sacred undertaking is a yajna. Can our gathering here be a yajna? Here is a remark in the Rig Veda. Yajna is the navel of the cosmos. Sacrifice is the very navel of maintaining order in the cosmos. This is true in every spiritual teaching, including in Christianity and Judaism. When it is said that God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son. Sent for what? For sacrifice. Christ himself refers to this, that this is his mission, to be crucified. I don't want to go into those details. You can read my book on the Yoga of the Christ to get all those details if you wish. But just to remind you, although I said you don't find this any of the canonical Gospels, but in a non-canonical Gospel, Gospel of Thomas, you find this remark. Jesus said, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that it is you who are the children of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you live in poverty, and you are the poverty." In fact, I personally don't know a stronger statement than this. Even in the Indian tradition, where Swadhyaya is very much emphasized, but it is not put so strongly as it is put here by Christ. Then, if any of you have seriously looked at yourself, there are two common consequences of self-study. One is fantasy, like most jihadis say, "Oh, I'm the son of God, so I can kill all the people who are not believers." That kind of fantasy, that I'm special, I'm chosen by God. The other is despair, because one begins to see all sorts of useless, unnecessary, or negative aspects within oneself. Remember, the whole universe, external universe, is mirrored inside us. So that includes the devil also. The devil is also there. Or if you prefer more recent kind of terminology by some of the psychiatrists, they would say the shadow side of us. that is also there. And then one begins to become a little despair. Oh, I am so bad. I should not continue with this. So, therefore, it is highly recommended to undertake spiritual practices in the company of some fellow searchers. Gradually, one begins to see that fear and desire, or fear and selfish desire, are universal characteristics of human beings, although in each case manifesting in particular ways. We begin to understand that the whole of humanity is run by forces of reward and punishment, by the wish for approval and the fear of disapproval. Whole humanity. Look at yourself. Which is why such a strong emphasis on self-study. What we say about human beings also applies to me. And then naturally one wonders, how can I gradually become more and more free of this? It's not that one is necessarily stuck there. If the Christ or the Buddha, or in modern times somebody like Krishnamurti, were not free of some of these things, why would we bother to listen to them? But we need to begin precisely from where we are, not from the level of the Buddha or Ramana or Krishnamurti, not from the self with a capital S, or the Atma, which is identical with Brahma, according to all the Upanishads, but from the usual ordinary self, which occupies me with anxiety, sense of pleasure, and wish for revenge, or setting everyone straight, etc. What is needed is more and more impartial self-perception. That is what Rumi is calling us for. If you recall his very first remark that I quoted. Because real knowing and transformation or becoming, I have given Sanskrit words for it, are spiral in nature, nourishing each other. As I know something, it gradually changes something. A classic remark in the Mundaka Upanishad, one who knows Brahma becomes Brahma. Very strong suggestion. Therefore, what is required is a little detachment from what is seen. Otherwise, one wants to change what is seen in myself. I want to improve it or shine it, or wish to hide what I don't want to be seen about myself. It is almost as if I need to sacrifice the visible for the power to see. The reason I'm saying that, because one then gradually begins to see that the quality or the intensity of my perception itself needs to be enhanced. Imagine if the Buddha is seeing something or Christ is seeing something, almost certainly he would have a clearer perception than I do. So if I get too stuck with what I see and try to change it or improve it, then I am less concerned about the quality of my perception. So therefore, a very strong suggestion, I see many things, not to get so occupied with this, but to become more interested in enhancing the quality of my perception so that I can see more and more impartially, because quality of perception itself changes what I see. I will point out to you soon. Any serious self-study involves awareness of the way it really is, not the way I wish it to be or hope it to be. And awareness has the magical power of transformation, not according to my ideas, but according to perception. Conscious seeing originates from a subtler level of the self than the functions. Again, simply to remind you, when I say the functions, our mind is functioning, body is functioning, emotions are functioning. But whenever we say that the soul has taken on the body, that soul has an aspect of consciousness in it, which is not a function, it's not a mental thinking. So this is the remark here. Awareness or consciousness has the magical power of transformation, not according to my ideas, but according to perception, a direct perception. Conscious seeing originates from a subtler level of the self than the functions. Functions originate from my body and mind. Consciousness originates from the soul. The sort of knowledge involved in any impartial self-inquiry by itself leads to self-transformation. Real seeing transforms whatever is seen. I actually give a very simple example of this. Awareness is not only the main principle of transformation, it is the only force or mechanism of transformation. But why should you believe it? Experiment with it and verify it. I often invite all my friends to be searchers rather than believers. Don't believe anything I say either, or any other great sage says. Real philosophy is an existential science or experiential science. Simple example, if you pay attention to your breathing, the quality of your breathing will change. You can try it right now, take a few moments. If you lovingly look at a child, guaranteedly the quality of that child will change. The tragedy is most people are too busy with their profession, they don't even look at their sons and daughters with love, with any length of time. In fact, I even invite you, take two plants, put them more or less equally sun receiving kind of spaces near your house or in your house. One plant you pay no attention to, another plant you look at every day for a few minutes with a sense of love. You can try it. Don't just take my word for it. I guarantee in 3 weeks you will see these two plants acting quite differently, showing different kind of color, different kind of growth. But if you just believe it, then you're not a good searcher. Don't believe it. Try it. But that's a very external example. But internal example is just pay a little attention to your breathing and the quality of your breathing will change. Similarly, if you carefully, honestly see again and again that I am greedy, gradually you will see that the quality of your greediness will change. Don't decide to change, because then that automatically comes from the same place, which is trying to improve myself so that I look better, behave better. No, just simply impartially watch, like a good scientist, not trying to change it, just clear perception. So I make this general suggestion here. Self-awareness leads to self-transformation. Knowing and being are very intimately connected. Great philosophers like Plotinus have actually made a similar remark that awareness is the mechanism of transformation. Then I have quoted to you here a remark of Krishnamurti. He said, if you see what is changes. But it's easy to accept this, but I invite you to try to challenge it, to question it, if it is true for you. Then there is a very strong suggestion from all the sages that we cannot ascend to truth or God or Brahma, but that truth or God or Brahma may descend to us. However, we need to do our part. This was actually the reason why Krishnamurti, probably more than any of the contemporary sages that I have met, insisted on not doing anything. In fact, on one occasion, he even said to me, "Well, the sun is shining. What do you have to do about that?" So I said, "Sir, if I have the curtains drawn, I can't see the sun. So something is required from my side. But I can't create the sun. So the sun is shining quite by itself without taking one person into account or another person in account. But not everybody can receive the sun if they don't open their windows and remove their curtains." So this is the aspect here, which, as I said, with Krishnamurti, he actually dismissed this, saying, "Oh, you're too clever for your own good." Maybe that is true, but I invite you to seriously consider this, that always a reminder from all the sages that we cannot ascend to truth or God or Brahma, but that truth or God or Brahma may descend to us. However, we need to do our part. The main aspect of our part is the repeated recognition that something in me is not right. Something interferes with the descent of the truth. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, what is not right is the barking mind. So the very first substantial sutra is how to stop, that the whole purpose of yoga is to stop the movements of the mind. If you're interested in the Yoga Sutra, it's the second sutra in the first chapter. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's the Sanskrit version of it. Yoga is stopping the movements of the mind. So something interferes with the descent of the truth, and I need to see it and to suffer it. I need to suffer the gap between what I know and what I am. It's easy to read the scriptures. It's easy to read what Madame Blavatsky brought, or Krishnamurti brought, or Gurdjieff brought, the Buddha brought. Many wonderful sages have been throughout human history again and again. But I need to see it and to suffer something in me, the gap between what I know, it's easy to read these things, and then what I am. That suffering is not a suffering of the ego, feeling unappreciated, but an awareness of a betrayal of my very raison d'etre. Raison d'etre, you all know, literally means the purpose of my existence. Self-inquiry is not only what am I, but also why am I here? Then, this is another remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, a searcher also begins to see that below the layer of fear and ambition, there is an aspiration for a connection with the source of all life and for meaning. In moments of insight, we realize that we are both the searchers and the objects of our search. Ultimately, of course, as Krishna says, the self knows the self by itself. Remember, there is a divine particle in you, in me, which is the only reason I am existing. I didn't create myself. Keep coming back to this realization again and again. Then one would see or ask again, what does this divine particle want me to do? Why has it bothered to create me? Me here referring to my body and mind, obviously. That's the thing. That's again. So here is a remark of a great Christian mystic, Boehm. When says, not I, the I that I am, know these things, but God knows them in me. Now, that's a very great mystic. We are far from God directly, no, but even the soul, which is a much lower level of the divine spirit, then, as I said earlier, the distinction between soul and spirit. It has got completely confused. Most of my Christian friends confuse these two words. In fact, it started in the 16th century with Descartes equating spirit with soul and with the mind, if you can believe it. That's what he did in his book. You're welcome to read that book called, I think it's called In Method or something like this, the title of the book in English. Then this is one of the non-canonical sayings of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is within you, and whosoever knows the self shall find it. And having found it, ye shall know yourselves that you are the sons and heirs of the Father, the Almighty, and shall know yourselves that ye are in God, and God in you, and you are the city of God. This is the remark of Christ. Of course, non-canonical, but then. Here is a remark of Plotinus, one of my most favorite philosophers. One that seeks to penetrate the nature of the divine mind must see deeply into the nature of his own soul, into the divinest part of himself. But let me remind you, self-study or swadhyay is a very long journey with many obstacles and side shows. But to become truly myself, I need to know myself. If I do not take myself seriously, who else will? But it is a very serious undertaking. It can sound easy, but knowing oneself impartially, without trying to improve it or do this or that, just simply watching it, because that watching impartially itself brings about the transformation. If I try to bring about the transformation, I interfere. So I am now suggesting a simple exercise if you wish to try it. As impartially and clearly as you can manage, look at yourself as you manifested in the last 24 hours. Was there an occasion when you saw someone with love and compassion, or with a willingness to learn something? Also, was there any situation in which you asserted yourself or tried to impress somebody? The reason I am suggesting this so that you actually try these things yourself. Otherwise, I say something, you listen to something, you believe it or you disbelieve. What's the point of all these webinars? I don't know. I am too old now to continue doing any of these things. So I invite people to take these things seriously and to carefully look at yourself in the last 24 hours. That will be at least the beginning of impartial self-study. Not approving or disapproving, not admiring or condemning. I am what I am. I need to see what I am, rather than to either admire it or admonish it or do anything. But that careful, clear seeing actually brings about a change. That is what I have been trying to emphasize. So, this is, at the end, I often say to people, you're not obliged to do it, but on my website, there are many articles, many interviews, etc. If you're interested, you don't have to pay for any of that. You can look at it. And then if you have any questions, you can write to me at my email. It's ravindra@ravindra.ca. So now you look at this remark of Rumi, everything in the universe is within you. Ask all from yourself, which is the reason for this impartial self-study. You will find both God there as well as the devil, and you need to find their appropriate place. The devil also was the son of God. He didn't create himself. In fact, I especially recommend to my friends, particularly from the Judeo-Christian background, to read the book of Job. The very opening paragraphs say there, when all the sons of God were gathered together, among them was Satan. Satan is also son of God. His function is to test anybody who claims to be pious or a son of God or follower of God. So that's his job. He's the head examiner. None of the prophets, including Christ or Moses or anybody, Abraham, could come to God without being tested by the Satan. So don't get against the Satan. He's the examiner. He'll flunk you if you become against him. So now I think, is it okay, Ananya, shall we take a few minutes break now?
Yes, let's go ahead and take a break.
Unless somebody wants to raise a question about any of the slides, then I won't show any slides. After the breaks, please bring your own insights or questions or objections to what I have said. This is perfectly fine. Okay, so.
All right. So we'll meet back in about 10 minutes.
Difficult time. If your primary insight is that consciousness can exist without matter, because it seems quite clear that consciousness or manifestation involves a polarity of some kind. Consciousness needs a vehicle in which to express itself. So how are you approaching that somewhat of a dilemma?
No, you see, consciousness, as you know, in these experiences that people have of so-called near-death experience, a lot of data is now gathered about that. And so a person is still in a way alive, even though he's not breathing, heart is not beating. So officially, from a medical point of view, he's dead. And furthermore, there is also a lot of data that in general it appears that in the room where this is taking place, as if consciousness is above any person, it's near the ceiling. So there is this increasing sense that consciousness can exist without connecting with matter. But in order for it to express something, then it needs to use a language or a mouth or something. That is true. So then the suggestion that if we say that God has the highest level of consciousness, then at various different levels, there are different levels of consciousness. One can certainly, or at least I hope that a deer has less consciousness than I do, although sometimes I'm not so sure of that. So similarly, among human beings, we would all probably agree that the Christ or the Buddha had a much higher level of consciousness than I do. So therefore, the suggestion that consciousness can exist without necessarily manifesting itself in matter, but for us to recognize that, it requires to manifest in matter. So the Galileo Commission is not against the expression, but it is trying to reverse the fundamental assumption that everything comes from matter onwards. So these days, as you know, every branch of science, whether it's biology through biophysics or geology through geophysics or chemistry through physical chemistry, they all become branches of physics. And even psychology, how the various neurons in the brain can move, etc. So, but my impression is if this commission succeeds, then physics itself will become a branch of psychology. That what is required is an inner search, deeper and deeper, which will be much closer to the overall emphasis in the spiritual realm. So the Galileo Commission is not going to succeed in any hurry, I can tell you that, because of the technological power that is now available through standard physics, which I told you, the expression behind that physics is that matter is primary. And then it is now, because of its connection with technology, has become more and more connected with power, with military or with power. In fact, a Nobel Prize winner, John Polanyi, who got a Nobel Prize in chemistry at the University of Toronto a few years back, he made this remark that science in connection with technology has done more harm to humanity in this century. He's talking about 20th century than anything else. Bigger and bigger weapons, First World War, Second World War, you can look at all this. So science is associated so deeply with technology that basically means more and more power, bigger weapons, fancier aeroplanes, etc. But clearly there is no reason to be against it. The question is there a consciousness that can use these instruments for the benefit of humanity? In fact, there is an organization called Scientific and Medical Network, which actually started the Galileo Commission. There I made this proposal. They have had many webinars on this. I suggested, how do we cultivate wise scientists? Because you have to be a fairly smart person to be a smart scientist. That is obvious. Nobody disagrees with that. But wise scientists are very few. What do we mean by wise itself is a question. But if we think that Christ was wise or the Buddha was wise, what are their qualities? Sense of compassion, sense of love, sense of oneness with the others. So one would think that that is what we mean by somebody being wise. But that is not so easy I have known many Nobel Prize winners in physics. For one reason or the other, have met them. Most of them you would not want to invite home for tea, I can guarantee. They're completely self-occupied. But they're obviously good minds. Otherwise, you can't get a Nobel Prize. So one has to be a little careful about what one is aiming at or searching for. Now, especially with artificial intelligence being used more and more, you can count on that some countries will begin to occupy the rest of the whole world. What do you think the US is doing? Look at the last 400 years. Every country in the planet has been ruled by people coming, first of all, from the Judeo-Christian background, partly because the secular power and the religious powers got mixed up. In England, the moment somebody becomes a king or a queen, they become the head of the church. So religion and power have been so much mixed up, especially in the Christian world. So they occupy the whole planet. You look 400 years. Gradually, increasingly, people begin to question. Even within these countries, there are people who are questioning what is the purpose of our existence. There is more and more interest now, actually more in USA than in India, on studying yoga. You may be surprised by this. But sometimes it can be just physical yoga. How can I increase my sex appeal? But it can, for some people, they become more seriously engaged with this. And Walter here can tell you why is he interested in the Indian spiritual tradition. It brings a slightly different perspective. So people get more interested, more knowledgeable about this. And it can gradually begin, the planet is going to undergo a major change. Otherwise, as your president is now doing, wants to control everybody. Anybody else wishes to bring either a question or your own insight about something, about self-inquiry or really anything to do with any kind of spiritual practice? Self-inquiry is a fundamental requirement. That's why I am focusing on this.
Ravi, we have a question in the classroom.
Ravi?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said.
We have a question in the classroom.
Yes, please, can you read it?
Nice to see you, Ravi. Always wonderful to see you.
David says it's nice to see you. It's always good to see you.
Well, that's not a question. I'm happy to say that. Unless he's questioning himself, why is he happy to see me?
Okay, so the question is, when you're talking about self-sacrifice, I realized at another level, the ultimate self-sacrifice really feels like to me, as we move toward purpose and we continuously get inspired into purpose, that we surrender and sacrifice our personal will for something larger. And that seems like the greatest sacrifice from a deeply personal place. And in that movement toward purpose and that surrendering, we move more and more toward unity. And that's where we run into the fields of inspiration and love and compassion, and we're shown more as we move into that territory. So it seems like to me that the greatest self-sacrifice is personal will into our divine will. But it's not like for me, it doesn't feel like some kind of sacrifice. It feels like a joyful surrender into something that brings more joy and brings more a sense of why I'm here. And it also feels like as we move into purpose, and begin to live our purpose and begin to be our purpose, that we're actually sustaining the light on the planet, and that we start to become the fibers of the light itself that are holding this thing together. So it's from that place of ultimately sacrifice that we actually continue to bring light to the planet. And not only light to the planet, but a connection into the fabric of humanity itself.
Yeah,
So I was just
you
wondering
know, we don't need to use the word sacrifice only in the negative sense of getting rid of something. Sacrifice literally means to connect with the sacred, as I try to point this out. So what you have said, if somebody actually undertakes the kind of action that you just mentioned, connecting with the sacred is not getting rid of something.
right.
But some of these, you see, one of the difficult, we need the language, but one needs to be very careful about the language. It can have slightly different meanings, or the meaning may have changed over the years. These days, the word sacrifice doesn't get used with that sense intimately connected with it, namely connecting with the sacred. That's the root of the word sacrifice. But for example, if an athlete says, I sacrifice going to the movie tonight because I have a race tomorrow, he's not connecting with the sacred. He's still looking for his self-aggrandizement. So that would not be considered sacrifice from a spiritual point of view, even though he may think he's sacrificing something. So one needs to be a little careful about the word being used. To connect with the sacred requires a slight freedom from what I'm usually connected with. Anybody else wishes to bring a remark or a suggestion? We don't have to necessarily hang around. We can say, okay, tomorrow. Turner, am I reading your name correctly?
Yeah,
Or is it
you got it, Tanner. Yes.
Tanner? Yeah.
Hi, yeah, nice to meet you. I'm just a local kid in Ojai, basically, and I've just started my yoga journey, which has led me to studying philosophy, different things like the Bhagavad Gita and Sankhya and the Yoga Sutras. And so I was just curious if you could explain or just maybe help me to understand um, how we can distinguish knowledge that's gained from within from maybe knowledge that's influenced by our readings that, as we know, can be corrupted and changed and could influence us in different ways. Do they coexist? And is it, like you said, just that we have to discover for ourselves what works? Or is there a way to kind of understand, oh, this is something that's come from self-inquiry specifically, and it's not maybe just coming from a thread of something else?
Well, from the perspective of the spiritual teachers, and you can find specific remarks like this in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, or in the Yoga Sutras, since you're reading these books. From their point of view, knowledge, what they would call real knowledge, is something that transforms the knower. It's not that the knower just acquires more and more knowledge. the knower is transformed by that knowledge. And almost always the suggestion is that real knowledge, certainly from a spiritual point of view, has associated with it an element of love, which is why, for example, in the Bhagavad Gita, explicit remark, the knower of the truth loves me, Krishna says, and those who love me love the truth. So truth and love will constitute a together meaning of real knowledge. Now then in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra specifically, there is even another suggestion that real knowledge is free of time sequence. The Sanskrit word is kraman. That's what is used by Patanjali. Now, time sequence free of, if you remember in Gospel of John, if you're interested, it's the 8th chapter in the Gospel of John, 56 verse, where Christ says, before Abraham was, I am. Now, you see, he's free of the time sequence. But tragedy is the audience, the very next verse says, then they pick up stones to try to kill him. Because for most other people, it doesn't make any sense. Similarly, it is said in the Indian tradition, when the Buddha was enlightened, he became nirkal, meaning without time or beyond time. But to be free of time sequence doesn't mean to be against time, because the Buddha also became what is in Sanskrit is called Trikaldarshi, meaning seers of 3 times, past, present, and future. He could see those 3 times. So to be free of time sequence doesn't mean to be against time, but being free of it, I gave this example from Christ, but similarly, there are other great sages would say that they saw something a few centuries ago. Now, it makes no sense to us ordinary mind. So, question of time is in fact always a great mystery. In fact, this is a remark of St. Augustine many centuries ago. If nobody asks me what time is, I'm very clear about it. But if somebody says, what is time? I don't know what to say. This is St. Augustine's remark. And as long as nobody asks him, it's all, everybody's clear. You know, what's the time now? So one can say, what is the time now? But the real nature of time is very complicated. So this remark that I just quoted, this is in the Yoga Sutras. Freedom from kraman, from time sequence, is the real knowledge. If you have I'm not trying to sell my books, but I wrote a commentary on the Yoga Sutras, so you can read there. I try to point this out specifically.
Yes, I actually have it coming in the mail, so I'll be reading it.
Okay. But I often recommend to people to buy my books on the Amazon is more expensive than simply to write to me. I can ask somebody to send them to you. It's cheaper. Yeah. But anyhow, so anybody else wishes to bring a remark or a question? Or Mika, please.
So thank you. Wonderful presentation. There was an expression during the presentation that was self-study is a long journey with many obstacles and side shows. Intuitively, I can get it, especially the concept of obstacle. But can you give an example of what would be a side show? Some, I don't know, do you mean something that distracts us, some false conclusion? How would you define a possible sideshow in this quest of self-study?
Well, you know, self-study is the fundamental requirement of spiritual journey. Then think of a journey. If you're climbing, especially a slightly difficult mountain, sometimes one meets an iceberg or some has other problems like this. And it's every searcher's experience. One sometimes says, hell with it, I can't do it. It's too much. And Therefore, there are always step forward and step backward or step sideways. This is why it is very helpful if you happen to meet a fellow searcher. They may be coming from a different side. They can even point out, oh, there are icebergs there. Don't go that way. That's not going to be good. And it's also true that each of the searcher naturally begins from where they are. And very simple examples, since you are in the USA, I give you an example from USA. If people were trying to get to the White House, if somebody is coming from the desert, they will start on a camel. If somebody is coming from the Pacific Ocean, they will start on a boat. If they're coming from Canada, they can start on a car. So you see, the starting points are different. Excuse me for a moment, the phone is ringing. I'll stop it. So you see, people coming from different places need to begin in a different vehicle. And so people can already say, oh no, you have to go in a car. So what do you do if you're coming from the Sahara? So it is important for us to appreciate that everybody needs to begin from where they are. And therefore, different kinds of, sometimes you look at even different monasteries. Christian monasteries, the kind of clothing that the monks wear there are different from what they wear in Buddhist monasteries. It just depends on where they started from. Then, of course, one can get stuck with it. It becomes part of the tradition. That's a different matter. But it might interest you to know a Zen monk in California started wearing jeans. But in general, they still carry on wearing the same kind of clothing as they would have done in Tibet or somewhere else. So one needs to be very careful not to get stuck that there is only one way. Each one of us needs to find our absolutely unique journey, but one can learn a great deal from other searchers. Especially, as I just said, if you meet a searcher, they can point out some parts are dangerous, not to go that way or this way. But if they are reliable searchers, otherwise trouble is the religions are just trying to convert people to themselves rather than trying to assist a spiritual search. And then, well, I don't want to go into the details of this, but if you look at the history, you'll be surprised how many temples in India were destroyed by Christian missionaries, Hindu temples, and trying to bribe people to become Christians, blah, 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 all this kind of thing. So this is the reason why the present government has actually now forbidden transfer of any funds from outside to India. Because billions of dollars were being spent by people, especially in southern USA, to convert people into Christianity. Not exactly that they are following themselves the teaching of Christ, but that it's easy to just convert people so they can get to heaven. So that kind of tragedy is there, but each path, my impression is we can learn a great deal from the teachers or from groups of searchers, but everybody's journey is unique, absolutely unique.
Yeah, thank
So-
you for that, because it made me think about some word of wisdom that the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius gives in his meditation. And he says, not to feel exasperated or defeated or despondent because your days are packed with wise and moral action, but get back up when you fail to celebrate behaving like a human, however imperfectly, and fully embrace the pursuit that you embark on. So even a Stoic philosopher has a little bit of comfort in this journey, celebrate behaving like a human.
Yes. Now, even for example, it's helpful to have a remark like this that can sometimes assist one to remain a little quiet and calm. So there is no reason to be against any of these teachings, particularly the great teachers like Christ or the Buddha. They are very absolutely remarkable, very few in human history. But that is the overall call. But very few. Don't imagine it's easy to come to that level. Yes, Maria, did you wish to? Please unmute yourself.
It reminds me also of Tanner's question, because that really is I mean, the two things that have been brought up are related, because life is presenting to us every moment things that we need to be aware of that will help us to be more self-aware and connected with our own path. And those intuitive flashes that come from nowhere, that are not connected with past thought, but are new and fresh. And these are the moments that we can still treasure, and begin to recognize more and more, not only when they arise in our own consciousness, but when they arise in the consciousness of others.
Yes, no, I agree. And I think one of the suggestions I could make from a practical point of view for anybody who is interested, if at least for 5 minutes each day, you just simply ask yourself impartially, not to try to prove anything to anybody else, but to yourself, what was something really worthwhile or admirable, or something that I am critical of, I did in the last 24 hours. Just so that you look at yourself impartially, not to be approving or disapproving, but just looking at it, not to get worried about it. Because as you just quoted saying, you are what you are. You're a human being. And you have the devil in you as well as God in you. So sometimes one takes over, sometimes the other takes over. And therefore, don't be against yourself, but more and more impartially to look. That's what I recommendation. Even to allow just 5 minutes a day, preferably more. And that would be, that's the real meditation. Meditation really is closer and closer to true self-perception. Anybody else wishes to say something? Otherwise, we can happily stop. We don't need to be stuck with the idea that we must be here for 2 hours.
Dick Schaefer has a comment from the classroom.
Yes.
Ravi, would you comment on Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry method as
Sorry, please say that again. Comment on what?
on Ramana Maharshi's technique of self-inquiry as to continually asking who wants to know to get to the witness.
That was his strongest suggestion whenever people asked him what will be a good way to become more spiritual or come to God or whatever people wanted to say. He always recommended to them to impartial self-inquiry. So that my impression is you can look at any of the teachers, modern ones like Krishnamurti I quoted earlier, or Gurdjieff, or Jean de Salzman, or Raman Maharishi, Vivekanand. These are the modern sages. But if you look at the ancient ones, Christ or Krishna or the Buddha, Patanjali, they're all strongly recommending impartial look at oneself. Because without that, I'm just imagining something or the other and don't see what is actually running my life. But so impartial look is very important. But since you mentioned Raman Maharishi, there is another very important, I very much admire him. He was a very great sage, as some of you know. And most of you may not know that the only book he actually read in full was the Bible. He hadn't read any other book. And somebody asked him one day, how should we treat the others? He said, but there are no others. Now, to actually be honestly coming from that level is not so easy. I could use these words, but that's not what makes it true. This is one of the things I have often said. Expression of truth is not the truth. Truth is something embodied by somebody. And then it manifests in everything they do or they say. Anybody can quote what the Buddha said or what Christ said. That doesn't make it true. But those remarks may call us to relate to something. So do keep this in mind. Expression of truth is not the truth. And this is also the reason I often point out that in the modern world, in the Indian tradition, some of the expressions are quite differently used than they are in the Abrahamic tradition. For example, in the Abrahamic tradition, if anybody said that I am one with the Father as Christ did, he's crucified. In the Indian tradition, he will be glorified. There is a whole different attitude to this. There is a whole different, if you like, a metaphysical background to this. This is maybe not the time for me to go into, or unless somebody wants me to say something more about it. Because in the Indian tradition, we don't have a myth of creation, which, if you look at the Abrahamic tradition, the myth of creation, God created the whole world, but God is different from the world. No angel, even the highest angel, cannot come to God. Lucifer was the highest angel. And because he wished to be like God, so he is expelled from heaven. You can read this in the prophet Isaiah's remarks that I just mentioned. On the other hand, in the Indian tradition, we don't have a creation myth, but what we have, this is my remark, I have never heard anybody else use that expression. I call it the emanation myth. Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality, literally Brahma means the vastness or the largeness or eternal. Brahma did not create the world. The whole world emanated from his substance. So everything in the world, even the rocks, have a part of Brahma in them. And very strong emphasis, this is clarified by the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, that just as the spider web emanates from the substance of the spider, but then the spider can move anywhere on the web or even away from the web. So Brahma is not stuck in the manifested universe, although the whole manifested universe has emerged from his substance. This is an analogy given in the oldest Upanishad trying to clarify this. So therefore the call in the Indian tradition is for everybody, even for a cow or a deer, or literally speaking, even by a rock, to find that level in them which is identically the same as Brahma. In fact, Atma, which literally means yourself, is identically the same as Brahma, is regarded as the supreme identity in the Indian tradition. That is the call. But if anybody said that in the Abrahamic tradition, they are in real trouble. Christ is a good example. Al-Halaj in Islam is another good example of that. He said something very similar, and he was also crucified. So there are some fundamental differences in the tradition, and I keep reminding people that these days we are more and more in a global culture. How do we believe that half the sages got the matter wrong? This is where I repeatedly say expression of truth is not the truth. To actually have more than two expressions can sometimes help one to be free of the expression. Or another example I often give, at the very best, any teaching, even the teachings of the Buddha or Christ, at the very best, they are fingers pointing to the moon of truth. If you get so stuck to the finger, you'll never get to the moon. So great teachings can be helpful, but I highly recommend not to get stuck with any teaching. Ultimately, to see how it applies to me. If the Christ said, love your enemies, honestly to see, do I actually love my enemies? Can I possibly love my enemies? Otherwise, it's all very nice to say I'm a Christian. There are 3 billion people say they're Christians. How many of them are loving their enemies? Or even their neighbors? Remember, Canada is a neighborly country to USA. And, and so I think it's easy to repeat these words, which is why I repeatedly say expression of truth is not the truth. But to have more than one expression can sometimes assist one to look a little bit more carefully. For example, Christ says, the Father and I are one. I have never read anywhere in the Indian tradition God being referred to as the Father. Now, that doesn't mean we need to dismiss what Christ is saying, but is he pointing to the same thing as somebody in India would refer, Atman is Brahma? A great sage in India, Ramakrishna, at the end of the 19th century, actually undertook serious spiritual practices coming from Islam as well as from Christianity. He was of Hindu background, and he actually concluded from his experience that ultimately they lead to the same truth. For me, I can't say that from my experience because that's a very high experience, but it certainly makes much more sense to me, intellectually or otherwise, that these great sages are all referring to something the same, but their languages are different. Christ is speaking in Aramaic to people of Jewish background. The Buddha is speaking in Pali to people of Hindu background. So the languages are different, and therefore they can create differences. Therefore, again, I say expression of truth is not the truth. One needs to see who lived that truth. From whatever we know about Christ or the Buddha, or in contemporary times, Raman Maharishi will be a good example, then we would say they are living the truth. They are expressing the truth. Andrea, do you wish to say something?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask about self-study in the canonical versus the non-canonical gospels, and a lot of the examples that you give of self-study from Christianity or from the non-canonical gospels. And I'm not sure if there are examples from the canonical gospels of self-study. So if you could comment on that, but also related to that, I'm wondering if you think this difference in the frequency of the appearance of self-study between the canonical and non-canonical gospels is part of the reason so much harm has been done in the name of Christianity.
Well, one of the things one needs to look at, the moment any teaching gets organized, it is almost practically necessary for the churches to appeal to the masses more and more. And so anything that requires any kind of practice or undertaking is not emphasized. What is emphasized is believing something or that Christ was the only Son of God. Christ himself would be completely surprised by this. But that gets emphasized. And then I also try to remind all my Christian friends, now this is not my remark. As you know, you can read this in the Bible. Christ is saying something, and Pharisees, etc., are criticizing him that you are trying to destroy the tradition. So Christ says this. You can read this in the Gospel of Matthew. These are canonical Gospels. I have not come to destroy the tradition, but to fulfill it. What tradition is he fulfilling? Not Christian tradition. That didn't exist. He's fulfilling the Jewish tradition. So I remind people again and again that Christ was a Jew. All his disciples were Jews. And what his teaching is fulfilling the Jewish tradition. But then later on, politics enters into it, arguments, and Christians are trying to kill the Jews. They forbid them to come to Jerusalem. I don't need to go into the history of it. You can read it. So you see that one needs to be very careful. The moment something gets organized, for example, if something is organized around, let's say, Krishnamurti, they are not going to be quoting or advancing Gurdjieff teaching. If something gets organized around Gurdjieff, they're not going to be helping to remark on Krishnamurti's teaching. Organization just becomes stuck with a particular teacher, particular expression, and then trying to appeal to the masses, trying to make it easier and easier, simpler and simpler. If you just say Hail Mary 10 times, your sin is finished. That's easier, rather than learning.
Do you think it's about appealing to the masses or controlling the masses when religion is used as a political tool?
Both. But Therefore, anything that actually, you don't have to take my word for it. There is a famous author who has now passed away at Princeton University, wrote a book called Gnostic Gospels. I'm just forgetting her name. Maybe somebody else will remember her name.
Elaine Pagels.
Elaine Pagels. Now, if you read that carefully, she actually points out there, when people came with different perspectives in ships, their ships were drowned or they were killed, so that people are not just trying to give their ideas. That's the heart of what Christ brought. Any other thing, because the Gnostic Gospels are very much more emphasizing truer and truer knowledge, not just believing something or the other. But that gets excluded. So this is sad, but this is, as I just earlier quoted, now you look at contemporary Sanskrit English dictionaries, Swadhyaya becomes studying sacred books. This degeneration is almost lawful. It happens everywhere. Which is why then periodically great sages arise again. Look at within the Christian tradition. Remarkable sages like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, or Meister Eckhart, then some of them are chastised by the church organization. For example, John of the Cross was starved, etc., etc. He died in the 17th century, but was finally canonized in 2023, just because many people were very struck by his teaching. He wrote only 12 poems, and he's regarded as the greatest poet in Spanish language. I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know, but that's what my Spanish friends tell me. So great sages, similarly Meister Eckhart, and then he was excommunicated, etc. This goes on. Or Christ himself, he says something that is not acceptable, so he's crucified. This is sadly the case, that everything that is done is to fix something. Everything else is heretical. This is probably, I think, much more strongly expressed actually in the Judeo-Christian or in the biblical tradition, partly because of the combination of secular power and religious powers. That began actually in the 4th century with the emperor seeing the cross in the clouds and then starting from there. That all the canons were established after that. You can read the history of this. I don't want to go into the details. I think we need to stop. Unless somebody else has either a question or a remark to make. Okay, so we shall meet tomorrow. Actually, you probably are stuck with me for the next 10 or 11 days. But I will bring remarks of different sages each time so that we can, often much the same is said in different ways maybe, but it's still useful to have different sources. Okay.